Dr. Mark Jangizi here with your Science Moment. Today I'm going to talk about how when folks walk in with different conceptual frameworks or different paradigms in terms of how they look at the world, to scientists even, they can end up with radically different ways of coming to conclusions about what hypothesis is true, even if they agree on all the data. And this is something that's very relevant for what happened in COVID, because folks that walked in with very different kinds of conceptual frameworks or paradigms about what was going on indeed got led to very different kinds of hypotheses. Namely, some thought like, well, this is nothing to be, to go panic about, and others just completely panicked. So let me get to there by talking about the sense in which science is susceptible to something that concerns these things that are called prior probabilities or conceptual frameworks or paradigms, as Dr. Tim Barber and I talk in an old paper from 1998. Now, this is part of, I would say, a series of things about what science is and what science is not. And as we've talked about many times, science isn't this some kind of consensus voting on the basis of a whole bunch of scientists. It doesn't concern fact checkers in any centralized location. It doesn't concern some mechanistic process by which you just grind through like some kind of computer, and it can just take the data and just find the hypothesis. No, it turns out these things are not even decidable. These things require artistic inspiration of a particular kind, and this connects up to computational logic, limits of computational machines, something we've talked about before. It even concerns ethics. In science, you're going from a whole bunch of is's data to a whole bunch of oughts. You say, okay, given the data that it is this, you ought to believe this hypothesis to this degree. Well, how the hell did science get into the realm of oughts, right? And this is a deep kind of problem. It's called the riddle of induction. So what I wanted to talk about today is just I'm going to show you how, in another sense, science isn't what you think it is. It is much more relative. It's not that it is relative, but there's much more subtlety and complexity, such that two folks who are otherwise completely scientific, following the exact same data, can end up with very different beliefs. And then I'll get into how this happened with COVID. So let me give you just one example about a very simple belief about all crows are black. All right, suppose I've never seen crows before, and I say I don't know whether they're black or I don't know a thing about crows, and I want to come up with some kind of as I see more, to what extent do I believe that all crows are black? Now, a first thought you might have, let's say I'm going to let my space of hypotheses be, well, 0% of crows are black, 1% of crows are black, 37, all the possible percentages of crows are black. That's sort of like this line from 0% to 100%. I've got this whole range, and since I don't know jack about crow colors, I'm just going to give them a uniform probability distribution across it. Now, if I do that after I've seen 10 black crows, slowly this won't be flat anymore. The thing will get more lumpy up towards 100%. It gets more and more towards 100% as it goes on. And so it gets, let's suppose 100% is over there. I can never figure out left and right on this in the final version. It gets more clumped over there. And so this is 100. It gets tighter and tighter towards 100. But the 100% itself is never going to get any probability on it. It's all going to be under, like, all the peak is going to be at like 99.9% and 99.98%. More and more over there, but the actual probability given to the hypothesis that all crows, that 100% of crows are black, is actually going to still be 0. So I'm always going to, at any given time, give some number like, okay, the best estimate right now is 99.98% of crows are black, given all the data that I've seen, because still it's possible that there's some rare crows out there that I just haven't seen. So, but it's got to be a lot of black crows, relatively speaking, for me not to have seen any. So the best estimate is always going to be some really high number, but it ain't 100%. It's not going to be the one that all crows are black. Now that's itself kind of a problem. It's sort of an interesting problem in the philosophy of science as to how is it that then you can come to believe in the universal laws, which we all do. Well, this is where Doug comes in, because Doug, instead of starting this whole problem and saying, okay, let's consider 0% and 1%, 2%, all the way to 100%, and since I don't know anything, I'm going to give them all uniform probability, he says, well, let's just say I'm going to consider there to be 5 different kinds of hypotheses. There's just no crows are black, there's all crows are black, there's 50%, and then there's like less than 50%, or more than 50%, the in-between cases. I'm going to consider these 5 cases as the qualitative cases that I care about. And I'm going to give them all equal probability. So that means that you've got 5 regions, so each gets 0.2 of the probability. So I get 0.2 to 0%, or no crows are black, 0.2 to 100%, all crows are black, 0.2 to the 50-50 case, and then 0.2 to these in-between regions. Now, if I do that, if Doug does that, well, it turns out that after a very small number of black crows seen and no counterexamples, now the hypothesis that all crows are black is then just dominant. It dominates everything else, all those other 4 hypotheses there. So he'll believe very quickly that 100% of crows are black. He'll believe it much more quickly than will I. Now, in the long run, over the course of, let's say, years and years, I'll converge towards what Doug believes, because it turns out all crows are black, let's suppose. So we'll converge, but at any given time, it could be that I've only seen 4 crows, let's say, and he's seen 4 crows, and we agree 4 crows, only 4 crows, they're all black, and he already has 80% probability that all crows are black, whereas I have 0%. My highest probability is something like saying it's, okay, 87% of crows are black, it would be my conclusion. So we're still quite far apart. He thinks 100% of crows are black, and I only think 87%. And who is wrong? Neither of us are wrong. There is no, in the absence of any kind of argument, absence of any information, loud truck going by, we can't decide whose conceptual framework was right or wrong. These are conceptual frameworks you walk in the door with. You can't empirically argue against it and say, oh no, you had to use my empirical framework. On the basis of what? It's on the basis of nothing, because it's a framework that you have before you can even process the data. Science is filled with these things. This is called the riddle of induction. And how is it the case that, given this kind of conceptual frameworks people can walk in the door with, how is it the case that in real science, for the most part, we do tend to come over time, in the long run, find agreement? And there's a lot of theorems, like we saw, that Mark is eventually going to get closer and closer to the belief that Doug had, in this case, if it turns out Doug were right. And if it turns out Doug was wrong, and it's actually 99%, well, slowly, he'll actually converge to that, and I will as well, in the long run. All right? But in the short run is all that matters, because the long run could be arbitrarily far away. So now let's go to the case of COVID. So how did this kind of process, of which this is just one example that I gave you, affect the early beliefs for COVID? Well, for COVID, someone like me and those on Team Reality just said, look, the framework that we walked in was, like, there's no reason to believe that COVID is a disproportionately dangerous virus that should violate the expectations of all other coronaviruses. So on any given thing, let's suppose we're talking about natural immunity, and we could say you can have another horizontal scale about possible beliefs that you can have about COVID concerning natural immunity. One would be that it's really, really, really effective over here, to it being really, really not effective over here. And if you walk in with a conceptual framework that says, I don't know anything about COVID-19, it has no possible similarity to anything before, so we just have to abandon all of our wisdom about it, then you might put a uniform probability distribution on this, whereas you shouldn't do that. Folks like me have said, no, why would you do that? COVID-19 is called COVID-19 because there are other COVIDs, there are other coronaviruses, and there are other viruses, respiratory viruses, and they all have certain kinds of properties that we've known about for 50 to 100 years. So on the basis of that, we don't have to start with a prior that's flat about whether is natural immunity or not, and we could talk about it for seasonality or for whether it's asymptomatic transmission. All of these different kinds of things, the folks who said this is entirely novel and we can't, would just put potential uniform distributions on all of these, as if we had no experience prior to this on the basis of other respiratory viruses. In fact, even worse, it wasn't merely that it was an entirely novel respiratory virus. It was entirely novel and dangerous. So if anything, they wouldn't just put uniform distributions, they would tilt it towards the more dangerous stuff. A priori, before we know anything about this, we should presume it's even more dangerous. It's even less, it has less natural immunity that applies to it. It's more transmittable by asymptomatics. Everything about it, they actually pushed the prior. They walked in with a conceptual framework was not only flat, violating all the wisdom that we had historically, but actually tilted it the wrong way. Whereas those on Team Reality said, look, no, we're going to tilt this to be expecting it to be to first order, like we find all of these others. And we need to, if there's evidence that pushes away from that, that's fine. But we're going to start in walking in believing that it's like the other stuff. Now, we would argue that we're utterly rational to do that, because in fact that was the prior information. This wasn't the case like in Black Crows of us walking in not knowing anything about crows. No, we knew about respiratory viruses. We knew about coronaviruses. But once you have that conceptual framework and these differences in conceptual frameworks, ours tilted in each of these kinds of cases, asymptomatic transmission, seasonality, natural immunity, so forth and so on. In our cases, tilted towards them having the typical properties, whereas them tilted away from having the typical properties because they had been so hyped into believing that it was disproportionately new, novel, and dangerous. Well, then we can see all the same data that we want, as we did. We were looking at the same data. We've had more data during any crisis than ever that humans have had, and yet we disagreed. Why did we disagree? Because we had different conceptual frameworks walking in. And we had different conceptual frameworks because, we would argue in Team Reality, the folks that got afraid and got panicked and got into an echo chamber convinced themselves that COVID-19 was disproportionately novel and dangerous. And once those priors got all pushed in the wrong directions, not just even flat, but pushed in the wrong directions, it could take years for two otherwise equally astute scientists looking at all the same data that's really great data, it could take years for them to come to find agreement. Right? And that's what we found. Now, does that mean each of them are misinformation? Well, it turns out, I would argue they were in fact wrong, but I can't point to anything in the way they're handling the data that's necessarily wrong. I mean, in this kind of setup, there's nothing wrong about how they're handling the data. What was wrong was the way that they walked in, the kind of conceptual framework they assumed from the start. And once they did that, once that happened to their brains by virtue of the sort of the groupthink that led to that, there's no talking to them and arguing to them about the data. What it would require is going back to first principles, saying, look, this is all due to the conceptual framework that you walked in with being such that it weighed and it was sloshed in exactly the wrong way rather than the right way. And that's a very different kind of thing. That's not really an argument that's scientific, not in the sense that grinding through data using Bayes' theorem to modify a bunch of probabilities of hypotheses. That's sort of standard kind of ratcheting your way in a machine-like way through the data. But going back to priors and prior assumptions is very different. So I want to take this as yet another way of driving home the degree to which science is not the way that the average person thinks it is. Misinformation is not what people think it is. Misinformation can be two folks who just have different conceptual frameworks. They could each disagree with one another. Both of them can be wrong, but neither of them is misinformation per se, other than if you just want to call anything that's wrong. But they're probably both wrong. Most of science is wrong. Most of science is eventually found out to be wrong. And the hope, though, is that by having these priors, these conceptual frameworks, at least be open-minded in some sense. They don't give any of these probabilities zero. These hypotheses, zero probability. So that means eventually they'll slowly converge towards the truth, because it turns out that one turns out to be true. And that can take a long time. The only way that we can move towards the truth is to allow everybody to speak freely, allow many different conceptual frameworks, because if we're all stuck with the government's conceptual framework and it's the wrong conceptual framework, we could be years and years behind the truth. And conceptual frameworks, again, conceptual frameworks and even the choice of the hypotheses that you choose to put a framework upon are stuff that doesn't come from science itself. It comes from inspiration, other sorts of things. And to do that best, you just need lots of inspired people, decentralized out there in the world, to have that kind of artistic creativity that science depends on. And that was your science moment.